Have you ever wondered why no one has ever escaped the insane asylums of Warhammer 40K? Why not a single soul, not even by accident, has lived long enough to whisper what truly happens inside those lightless corridors? The Administratum has erased records, the Inquisition has burned testimonies, and entire research worlds have been wiped clean of any mention of these places, yet the question remains, lurking like a forbidden echo in the back of humanity's collective mind. The Imperium tells its citizens that these facilities are sanctuaries for the broken, havens for those whose minds have shattered under the crushing weight of the galaxy's horrors. But deep within the bureaucratic rot of the Imperium, a darker truth festers. These asylums are not healing centers, they are prisons built to contain nightmares the Imperium does not dare to confront. Those labeled insane are not always victims of madness, sometimes they are witnesses to truths so devastating, so cosmically unbearable, that the Imperium cannot risk their voices ever reaching another living ear. And yet, the question persists. It travels like a whispered ghost across Hive City slums, across derelict void ships drifting in forgotten sectors, across faraway worlds where people swear they've heard a scream that didn't belong to this universe. If no one has escaped, then who started the rumors? Who whispered the first warning? Who planted the seed of doubt in a civilization that does not tolerate questions? That is where our story begins, with a man who never meant to ask the question, and with the phenomenon that should have never, under any circumstance, found him. A man whose fate was sealed long before he realized that his thoughts no longer belonged to him. A man who would become the first person in recorded history to attempt the impossible, not to survive the asylum, but to understand it. His name was Raven Cade, an Imperial Lex mechanic who did not believe in ghosts, prophecies, or forbidden knowledge. He believed in numbers, in logic, in patterns, but sometimes, patterns reveal things that no human mind was ever meant to see. Sometimes, numbers whisper back, and when they do, the Imperium has only one solution: they disappear you into a place where no questions reach the outside world. Raven didn't know it yet, but the moment he detected the first anomaly, the asylum had already chosen him. It was already waiting. Raven Cade first noticed the anomaly on a quiet shift inside the data vault of Hive Solara, buried beneath hundreds of meters of concrete, steel, and forgotten history. His work was simple: catalog incoming numbers, reduce errors, and keep the Administratum's endless machinery of bureaucracy running. It was dull, suffocating work, the kind designed to crush curiosity and breed obedience. And Raven had always been obedient. But the anomaly was different. It appeared not as a glitch, not as corrupted data, but as a pattern. A perfectly repeating sequence woven into unrelated Administratum reports across thousands of sectors. A whisper of digits that should have never been able to form on their own. It was as if the numbers were speaking, a faint echo threading itself through the arteries of the Imperium. Most workers would have ignored it, but Raven's mind was wired differently. The sequence bothered him. It itched at the edges of his thoughts like a question begging for a voice. As days passed, he could feel the pattern tightening around him, growing clearer. He began to spot it in energy readings, in casualty reports, in astropathic transmissions. Even in the binaric murmurs of passing tech adepts. It was everywhere, like a heartbeat pulsing beneath the skin of reality. And then one night, while alone in the vault, Raven traced the numbers. Backward, following them across a web of hidden records, sealed files, redacted histories. What he found was impossible. Every strand of the pattern converged on the same place, an Imperial asylum designated only as Facility 13, a structure that did not appear on any map, any planetary archive, or any ecclesiarchal ledger. It should not exist. It could not exist, yet the numbers pointed to it with absolute certainty, like a cosmic accusation. That was when the vault went completely silent. Not quiet, silent. The hum of servitors stopped mid-motion. Cogitators froze. Even the air recyclers choked into stillness. Raven felt the cold bite of dread creep up his spine. In that unnatural silence, he heard something faint, almost imperceptible, a whisper woven into the stuttering feed of a half-dead data slate. It spoke in a voice that was not a voice, carrying a message that no sane mind should have been able to comprehend. Stop searching. He stumbled back, heart pounding, breath shaking. But the damage was done. The asylum had noticed him. The numbers had singled him out. And something far older than the Imperium had turned its gaze toward his insignificant life. Raven wanted to go home. He wanted to forget everything. But the moment he stepped into the corridor, he saw two black-robed figures waiting for him, inquisitorial agents bearing masks of blank metal, devoid of emotion, identity, or mercy. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their presence alone declared his fate. Raven Cade had asked a question. And in the Imperium of man, questions are death sentences. Raven did not remember being struck. He only remembered the sensation of falling without motion, falling inside his own skull, as if the world had been peeled away and replaced with darkness that had weight. When his senses returned, he found himself seated, wrists bound in cold metal restraints that dug mercilessly into his skin. The air tasted sterile, recycled 1,000 too many times. There was no sound except the faint clicking of distant machinery and the muffled beat of his own heart slamming against his ribs. He tried to speak. His voice cracked. No one answered. In front of him stood the two masked figures, motionless as statues carved from shadow. Their metal faces reflected nothing, no light, no humanity, no hint of what lurked beneath. For a long moment they only stared, as if examining the last flicker of resistance inside him. Then one of them lifted a device that resembled a portable cogitator, its surface etched with sigils that made Raven's eyes ache to look at. The device hummed, and Raven felt an invisible force scrape against his mind, searching for something he hadn't known he possessed. Memories he thought were safe, childhood moments, conversations, fragments of dreams, were pulled toward the edges of his consciousness like threads unraveling. He bit down on a scream as the metal-masked interrogator leaned closer, whispering words in a dialect older than the Imperium itself. The sound burrowed into his thoughts like insects gnawing through fragile parchment. And then, abruptly, it stopped. The device clicked shut. The masked figures turned away and spoke to each other in a garbled, Einharic drone. Raven understood none of it, yet he grasped one truth instinctively: they had found what they wanted. Facility 13. The anomaly. The forbidden numbers. He had become infected by knowledge. Moments later, he was dragged down a corridor illuminated by pale, flickering lights that cast his shadow in long, broken shapes. The floor beneath him vibrated faintly, as though the structure he was inside was not stationary, but moving, traveling somewhere distant, somewhere forgotten. Raven tried to fight, but the grips on his arms were impossibly strong. Reinforced by augmetics designed for efficiency, not mercy, he was a prisoner heading toward a destination he could not see. Eventually, they brought him into a cold, coffin-like chamber lined with restraints and monitoring implants. The door sealed with a hiss, locking him in a metal womb that smelled of rust and old screams. As the chamber grew darker, Raven realized where he was, a transport cell used by the Inquisition exclusively for high-risk minds. He felt his pulse quicken. People placed in these cells were not meant to arrive anywhere. They were meant to disappear. The floor shuddered. Gravity shifted. The cell vibrated as the transport vessel lifted off. Raven closed his eyes as fear clawed into him. He was being taken to a place the Imperium denied existed. A place from which no one had ever escaped. A place that had already whispered his name. Raven felt the moment the transport vessel broke through real space and descended toward the surface of a planet he had never heard of. The pressure in his skull shifted violently, making his vision pulse with darkness. Then, just as suddenly, the sensation stopped. The cell door cracked open with a grinding roar, releasing a gust of air so cold it felt like knives brushing against his skin. Two new figures stood outside, towering, gaunt silhouettes draped in tattered medical robes and wearing masks shaped like elongated skulls. Their breathing rasped behind the filters, slow and unnatural, as though their lungs were powered by machinery rather than life. These were not inquisitorial agents. They were something worse, something specialized, the attendants of Facility 13. Without a word, they unlatched his restraints and yanked him onto his feet. Raven stumbled, his muscles weak from confinement, his balance swaying like a man learning to walk again. The attendants' touch was cold and metallic beneath the fabric of their gloves, including one hand that felt nothing like a human limb. They marched him through a narrow corridor that sloped downward, deeper into the structure. Lights flickered overhead, their feeble glow revealing walls covered in scratches, some deep and desperate, others etched with symbols that made Raven's stomach twist. Every few meters, he heard distant noises. Not screams, not exactly. They were distortions, like voices being stretched through broken vox units, begging for release from throats that no longer remembered how to speak. The deeper they went, the more time seemed to distort. The air thickened with a metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat, and a low-frequency vibration hummed through the floor, so faint it felt more like a thought than a sound. It wasn't until they reached a vast chamber that Raven realized the facility was much older than it appeared. The structure wasn't merely underground, it was buried beneath layers of cities long forgotten, constructed on foundations that predated the Imperium itself. This place had been repurposed, not built, and the walls seemed to breathe. As the attendants dragged him forward, Raven's eyes caught something on the far end of the chamber, a massive slab of blackstone carved with runes that pulsed faintly like dying embers. A containment seal, ancient, malicious. The air around it was warped, as if reality struggled to remain aligned. Raven felt the same pressure he had sensed in the vault, the sensation of being observed by something without eyes. Something that recognized him. His pulse pounded, his breathing grew rapid. One of the attendants leaned close, whispering through its mask with a voice that sounded layered, multiple tones speaking at once. "Do not look at it." That was when Raven understood. This facility wasn't designed to keep patients inside. It was designed to keep something else from getting out, and whatever that something was, it had marked him. Even now, he felt its hunger, its attention, its anticipation. They dragged him into a small cell, bare, cold, and lined with mirrored metal that distorted his reflection into twisting shapes. The attendants stepped out and sealed the door. Alone in the silent chamber, Raven felt the truth settle like ice in his bones. Facility 13 was alive, and it had been waiting for a mind exactly like his. Raven sat in the center of the cold metal floor, trying to stop his hands from shaking. The cell was silent, not the natural hush of an empty room, but a calculated silence designed to suffocate thought itself. Even his breathing felt too loud, each exhale bouncing off the warped mirrored walls like an accusation. He could see his reflection in every direction, multiplied into dozens of versions of himself, each slightly distorted. In some reflections, his eyes seemed too wide. In others, his posture was subtly twisted. And in the farthest corner, one reflection wasn't moving at all, even though Raven was. His heart lurched. He scrambled backward, but the reflection snapped into motion a second too late, as if it were following him instead of mirroring him. He blinked, and everything looked normal again, dozens of distorted Ravencades staring back at him with fear carved into their features. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe trauma, maybe something worse, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The cell was observing him. He felt it in the faint charge in the air, in the subtle shifts of temperature against his skin, in the way the floor vibrated beneath him like a heartbeat. Something in the room was awake, watching, listening, waiting. He pressed his ear against the wall and heard a whisper, so faint it could have been imagination, so clear it couldn't be ignored. It wasn't a voice made of sound. It was made of thought. "Welcome." Raven jerked back, his spine hitting the opposite wall. The mirrored metal rippled under the impact, as though the surface were liquid for a fraction of a second. His breath trembled out of him, fogging the air. He forced himself to remain still, to hold tight to the remnants of logic he still had. There had to be a rational explanation. Some kind of psychic interference. Some kind of atmospheric distortion. Anything except the truth looming at the edges of his thoughts. The asylum was communicating. A dim light flickered above him, and a horizontal slit opened in the door with a slow, grinding moan. A tray was shoved through, a bowl of gray nutrient slurry, a cup of murky water, and a thin data slate. Raven stared at the slate, hesitant. The attendants hadn't spoken a single real word since his arrival. They didn't need to. Everything here was designed to break a mind without using brutality. Silence was their weapon. Isolation was their instrument. Thought itself was their battlefield. With trembling fingers, he picked up the slate. It flickered to life, displaying a single line of text. "Write what you saw." Raven felt his stomach twist. They knew about the anomaly. The numbers. The forbidden pattern. They wanted to understand how much he understood. And maybe, whether he could be used. The air thickened again, that same unnatural pressure pushing into his skull like cold fingers prying at his thoughts. It wasn't coming from the data slate. It was coming from the walls. He could feel the cell leaning in, as if eager to read over his shoulder. Raven's breath slowed. For the first time in his life, he understood true fear, not fear of death, but fear of losing himself. Fear of being hollowed out. Fear of having his thoughts rewritten while still conscious. He set the slate aside. "I saw nothing," he whispered aloud, hoping the cell would believe him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice, and the whisper returned, closer this time. "Liar." The walls warmed beneath his palms. The mirrors rippled like disturbed water. And in the far corner, the reflection that wasn't his own smiled, a slow, deliberate stretch of distorted lips that did not belong to any human expression. Raven pressed himself into the door, choking on terror. He wasn't alone in the cell. He had never been alone. And the asylum had just begun to introduce itself. Night never truly fell inside Facility 13, because there were no windows, no external clocks, no markers of passing time. Yet Raven felt night settle around him like a second skin. The hum of distant machinery softened. The lights dimmed to a pale, sickly glow. The air grew colder, pressing against him with the weight of 1,000 forgotten souls. In that artificial night, the cell changed. He felt it before he saw it, an atmospheric shift, like pressure gathering before a storm. The walls seemed closer, the reflections darker, and the distorted figure in the far mirror was no longer mimicking him at all. It stood still, even as Raven shifted. It tilted its head in a slow, unnatural motion, observing him with an interest that felt predatory. Raven's breath caught in his throat. Logic told him mirrors could not act independently. Logic told him reflections could not break formation. But the Imperium had taught him something else. Logic was a fragile thing in a universe where reality bowed to forces far older, far stronger, and far more malevolent. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the sense of being watched only grew stronger. His heart hammered. He forced himself to inhale slowly, to hold on to the remnants of rationality clawing for survival. When he opened his eyes again, the reflection was closer, no longer trapped in the far corner, but now standing directly behind him in the mirrored surface behind his shoulder. Its face was his, but wrong. The eyes were too dark, too hollow. The smile too wide, stretching beyond the boundaries of any human expression. He spun around. Nothing was there, only the cold, empty air of the cell. But in the mirror, the reflection didn't vanish. It leaned forward, placing a hand against the inside of the mirrored wall. The metal rippled under its touch like liquid mercury. Raven stumbled backward, hitting the door hard. His lungs tightened, breath stuttering in panic. A cold whisper seeped through the room, not a sound, but a thought echoing directly inside his skull. "You heard it too, didn't you?" Raven froze. The voice wasn't the asylum's. It wasn't the attendants. It wasn't human. It was his reflection. Each word slid into his mind like wet knives, sharp and cold. He shook his head violently, refusing to answer, refusing to acknowledge the impossibility unfolding before him. But the reflection continued, its smile stretching further, its features bending into something that no longer resembled flesh. "The numbers," it whispered. "They spoke to you. They always speak to the curious." Raven clamped his hands over his ears, but the gesture was useless. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was inside him, bypassing the senses entirely. The reflection pressed its palm harder against the mirror, and the surface bulged outward, as though reality itself were thinning. Raven's stomach twisted. He felt something in the room shift again, an ancient, oppressive presence stirring, like something slowly awakening after centuries of slumber. And then the reflection whispered the words that froze his blood. "They didn't bring you here to silence you." The mirror split with a thin, cracking sound. "They brought you here to feed me." The light flickered violently. Shadows convulsed across the walls. The air thickened into something almost alive. Raven's scream caught in his throat. The cell wasn't just listening anymore. It was opening. The crack in the mirror widened with a soft, sickening sound, like bone splitting under pressure. Thin lines branched out across the mirrored surface, glowing faintly as though illuminated from beneath by something alive. Raven backed away until he felt the cold door press into his spine, every instinct screaming at him to escape. But there was nowhere to run. The cell was sealed, silent, watching. The reflection, the copy, pressed both palms against the cracking surface now, grinning with a hunger that radiated from its distorted features. Its movements didn't match his anymore. They were fluid, serpentine, almost joyful. The glass bulged outward, stretching like skin straining to contain something too large, too old, too eager to be free. Raven's breath raggedly tore from his chest. His mind raced through possibilities, hallucination, warp interference, psychic contamination, but none of them mattered. None could protect him, none could explain the way reality warped before his eyes. And none could account for the whisper that filled the room, not with words, but with feelings, cold delight, ancient hunger, recognition. The crack expanded until a single black fingertip pushed through, dripping with a darkness that swallowed the dim light. The finger bent unnaturally, scraping along the steel floor, leaving behind a trail of frost. Raven's blood turned to ice. Something from behind the mirror was crossing into his world, using his reflection as a gateway. A second finger slipped through. Then a third. Then the beginnings of a hand that was almost human, yet not human at all. Too long, too thin, too deliberate in its movements. The mirrored version of Raven leaned forward, pressing its face against the widening gap as though smelling the air of the real world for the first time. Its voice came again, now whispering directly against his mind. I know your thoughts, Raven. I know your fear. I tasted them through the numbers. You opened the door. He shook his head violently, pressing himself harder against the door until pain lanced up his spine. His breath quivered in shallow gasps. The thing behind the mirror chuckled, a soft, broken sound like glass grinding against glass. Do you know what this place really is? The reflection asked. Do you think this asylum holds the insane? The glass bulged further, and half the creature's hand slipped through, flexing with disturbing elegance. The air grew thick with a cold so intense it felt like needles under Raven's skin. He watched as the malformed hand opened, palm facing upward, almost offering itself. No one escapes, it whispered. Because no one comes here by mistake. Raven's throat tightened, a desperate sound clawing its way up his chest. He had been brought here because the numbers had chosen him. Because the anomaly had spoken. Because he had been marked. The mirror suddenly buckled inward with a thunderous crack, shards trembling as though they had heartbeat of their own. The creature pushed harder, its arm now halfway through. The cell light sputtered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the light flickered back, the reflection was inches from him. Not in the mirror, in the room. Its smile widened, jagged and cold. And then, a shrill alarm tore through the facility, so loud it felt like his skull would split apart. The creature flinched, letting out a guttural hiss that sounded like metal scraping across tortured stone. The mirrors snapped back into place, the cracked ceiling shut as if reality itself was yanking the entity backward. The reflection vanished. Raven collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. But, even as the alarm continued to scream through the corridors, he knew the truth. The asylum wasn't protecting him. It was protecting itself, because something far worse than madness lived inside these walls, and now it knew his name. The alarm didn't sound like any warning Raven had ever heard in the Imperium. It wasn't mechanical, wasn't metallic, wasn't even technological in nature. It was organic, a long, rising wail that vibrated through the floor like the cry of some colossal beast trapped beneath the facility. The walls shuddered with each pulse of sound, their mirrored surfaces distorting violently as if the structure itself was panicking. And that was when Raven understood the purpose of the alarm. It wasn't meant to notify the staff. It was meant to contain the thing that had tried to step through. Raven dragged himself upright, his muscles trembling, his breath uneven. He wanted to believe the danger had passed, that the asylum had sealed the breach. But deep inside, he knew better. The entity hadn't been driven away. It had been interrupted. It had been denied. And nothing in this cursed place would deny it forever. Heavy footsteps thundered down the corridor, fast, efficient, purposeful. The cell door's locks snapped open, and the metal slab slid aside with a burst of cold air. Two attendants stormed into the room. Their tall, skeletal frames moved with unnatural precision, augmented limbs whirring softly beneath their tattered robes. Their skull-like masks glinted under the flickering light as they scanned the cell. They didn't look at Raven first. They looked at the mirror. Both attendants froze, their heads tilted in perfect synchronization, examining the surface for imperfections, fractures, distortions. Raven saw it in their posture. They weren't checking whether he was harmed. They were checking whether it had crossed through. After several tense seconds, one attendant produced a handheld auspex covered in sigils and dangling wires. The device whined softly as it passed over the mirrors. Raven didn't move, didn't speak, not until one attendant turned sharply toward him, bending down until its mask hovered inches from his face. Its respirator exhaled a cold burst of air that tasted like rust and chemicals. State what occurred, the attendant rasped. Its voice wasn't layered like the others. It was flat, clinical, too calm for what had just happened. Raven tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Something came through the mirror. Both attendants stiffened, just enough for Raven to notice. A reaction, a confirmation. It spoke to me, he whispered. It tried to silence, the taller attendant snapped. The single word wasn't shouted, yet it slammed into Raven like a physical blow, making him flinch. The attendants exchanged a rapid stream of binaric chatter, their voices crackling and clicking like broken circuitry. Raven understood none of it, but he didn't need to. Their urgency said everything. The breach mattered, the creature mattered, and so did he. One attendant seized him by the arm, yanking him to his feet with mechanical strength. The other produced a thin metal shackle and latched it around Raven's wrist. It hummed faintly, sending a prickling sensation up his arm. "What is that?" Raven asked. "A limiter," the attendant replied. "To reduce cognitive resonance." Raven's blood felt suddenly cold. Cognitive resonance. They were limiting his thoughts. Because his thoughts had attracted the entity. Because his mind was the door. As they dragged him out of the cell, the alarm continued to wail, echoing through the endless corridors like a death cry that refused to end. Doors slammed shut in the distance. Locks engaged. Machinery groaned. Something deep within the asylum stirred restlessly, as if the walls themselves were bracing for another attempt. Raven glanced back at his cell just once before being pulled away. And for a single, horrifying moment, a shadow passed across the surface of the mirror. Not a reflection, a silhouette, watching him leave, not defeated, not angry, patient. The creature knew he wasn't escaping. Nothing ever escaped, it simply whispered into the back of his mind, soft and hungry. Raven stumbled down corridors that twisted like serpents, each turn identical to the last. The attendants didn't speak, their limbs moving in mechanical precision, their masks reflecting nothing of what lay beneath. Yet the echo of the alarm continued in his mind, not fading, but mutating, warping into countless overlapping tones. He realized that Facility 13 was not merely a building, it was a labyrinth designed to distort perception, to twist time, space, and sanity until even the simplest thought became a maze. Every corridor he passed seemed to bend around him, reflections in polished metal walls shifting just enough to make him doubt his own orientation. Whispers began to seep into his skull, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the static of his own panic. Words formed and dissolved in an instant, voices that sounded impossibly distant yet unbearably close. Sometimes they spoke in Binharic, sometimes in dialects older than the Imperium itself, and sometimes in the numbers he had been tracking, the forbidden pattern that had brought him here. Every whisper clawed at him, tugging memories, twisting emotions, dredging up guilt, fear, and shame he hadn't known he carried. He realized something horrifying. The labyrinth was aware of him. It wasn't simply a place, it was alive in the way that the mirror creature had been alive, only slower, patient, eternal. The walls themselves seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Shadows stretched unnaturally, bending toward him when he paused, recoiling when he moved. And always, always, the whispers followed. They weren't threats, they were invitations. Invitations to see, to know, to understand what no human was meant to comprehend. The attendants guided him to a massive, spiraling stairwell. Its steps were slick and black, absorbing what little light the corridor offered. Descending, Raven felt his stomach twist as gravity seemed to shift subtly, tilting the world around him. He realized with a jolt that each step took him deeper, not just into the facility, but into a mental state he could not reverse. With every footfall, the whispers grew clearer, forming words he could understand. "They are watching through you. They are speaking through you. You are the pattern now." A chill ran through him. He understood at that moment that his mind had already been claimed. The numbers were no longer just a pattern outside of him, they were inside. Raven's thoughts no longer belonged to him. Each decision, each hesitation, each memory had been catalogued and repurposed, transformed into something the asylum could read, manipulate, and feed upon. At the bottom of the stairwell, the attendants paused. Ahead lay a massive, vaulted chamber, dark except for faint glows along its edges. The whispers had reached a crescendo, overlapping into a chaotic symphony of sound and thought that made Raven clutch his head. He felt the weight of every mind that had come before him pressing down, each one lost, each one broken, each one a note in the asylum's terrible chorus. And in the center of that chamber, a single pulse of light drew his gaze. It was subtle, barely more than a heartbeat in the darkness, but it beckoned him. A beacon in a place designed to trap the mind. Something inside him knew, he was being shown what the facility wanted him to see. Not for enlightenment, not for mercy, but because the asylum needed witnesses. It needed thoughts to consume, eyes to reflect the horror, minds to amplify the whispers. Raven Cade had arrived at the heart of Facility 13, and the facility had begun to feed. Raven stepped into the vaulted chamber, the pulse of pale light drawing him closer like a predator's lure. The whispers had become deafening, overlapping into a single, incomprehensible voice that clawed at the edges of his sanity. As he approached the center, he realized with a sickening clarity that the light wasn't illuminating anything, it was consuming everything around it. Shadows dissolved into it, reflections twisted and disappeared, even the air itself seemed drawn toward its impossible core. And then he saw them. The remnants of the minds before him, skeletons of thought, echoes of terror, fragmented patterns flickering in the ether. They were bound to the light, fused into it, becoming part of the facility's consciousness. Each had entered hoping to understand, to survive, to escape. Each had failed, and now, like a moth circling a flame, Raven understood that he had no choice but to follow the same path. The pulse of the light grew faster, thrumming in rhythm with his own heartbeat. The numbers, the anomaly that had first marked him, resonated within him, their sequences vibrating in his skull until he could no longer distinguish his own thoughts from the entities. He tried to resist, tried to pull back, but the steps he had taken brought him here willingly. The asylum did not trap him. He had carried himself into its heart with curiosity, with desire for knowledge, with the arrogance of a man who thought he could outwit a structure older than the Imperium itself. And then the light touched him. It was not pain. It was not fire. It was not death in any form he could recognize. It was understanding, a knowledge so vast, so utterly alien, that his mind tore itself open to accommodate it. He saw every corridor, every cell, every reflection of himself that had ever existed. He saw the whispers, the reflections, the shadows, and the creatures that had tried to cross. He saw the patterns behind the numbers, the hidden structure of reality the Imperium feared to acknowledge. And he knew, in the deepest recesses of his soul, that escape had never been possible. Raven Cade ceased to exist. Not in body, his form slumped silently into the light, but in mind. His consciousness was folded into the facility itself, another pattern feeding the greater entity that had been awake long before the Imperium's first stars shone. And as the light pulsed, the whispers calmed, blending into a single, eternal rhythm that carried the knowledge of all who had come before him. Yet, somewhere deep in the recesses of the chamber, a fragment remained. A spark of awareness, almost imperceptible, like a shadow behind a shadow. It whispered a single question, as if mocking the universe. Who will come next? Facility 13 was patient. Facility 13 was eternal. And the anomaly, the pattern, the hunger, it would wait as long as it needed. Because in the asylums of Warhammer 40K, no one ever truly escapes. Not the mind, not the soul, not even the numbers. The light dimmed, silence reclaimed the chamber, and somewhere, deep within the labyrinth, the walls pulsed faintly, alive with all the questions that had ever dared to ask, ready for the next mind to wander too close. The story ended, but the whispers did not. With that said, thanks for watching and until next time.